when it comes to the Beatles that you've heard over the years?
Oh, strange conspiracy theories. My goodness me. I suppose the most morbid one was that
In 1962, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison decided they wanted to fire drummer Pete Best. They unceremoniously replaced him with Ringo Starr and, in many ways, forgot about Best. Why was he really kicked out? Was it fair? Was it the most underhanded, unfortunate, and unforgivable chapter in the Beatles' rise to monumental power? Do Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr stay in touch with the original Beatles drummer? Curious about all this? Stay tuned as now, at 82, Pete Best finally reveals how the Beatles didn't get along. The dynamic between Pete Best and the Beatles. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr's relationship with Pete Best, the original drummer of the Beatles, has been marked by distance over the years. There is no documented evidence of ongoing contact between them. Tony Bramwell, a Beatles associate and biographer, portrayed Best as reserved and possibly permanently depressed, suggesting he had a demeanor that didn't align with the band's energy. Best's mother, Mona, played a crucial role in booking early gigs for the band and was notably supportive. The decision to replace Best was delivered bluntly through Brian Epstein, who conveyed the band's belief that Best wasn't up to par as a drummer, despite years of performing together. Even after auditioning for record labels like EMI Parlophone, producers like George Martin and Bert Kempfert had expressed similar concerns about Best's drumming abilities. Following his dismissal, Best reluctantly played a few more gigs before Ringo Starr was able to join permanently, a transition that deeply hurt Best, who felt his bandmates avoided facing him directly. Reflecting on the decision years later, both Paul McCartney and George Harrison acknowledged the necessity of parting ways with Best for the band's musical evolution, yet they expressed regret over the timing and manner of his dismissal. Ringo Starr's comments about Pete Best's drumming abilities were not always flattering, though there appeared to be no genuine reason for criticism. In a 1964 interview with Playboy magazine's Gene Shepard, Ringo mentioned filling in for Best in Hamburg due to Best's supposed use of pills that made him ill, implying drug use which was unfounded. This offhand remark, though likely meant in jest, was published and led to a libel lawsuit from Best against Ringo. Contrary to his bandmates, who occasionally used stimulants like Preludin, Best abstained from drugs and remained faithful to his girlfriend in Germany, reflecting his strong stamina as a drummer, influenced by his background in athletics, particularly in rugby and boxing. The legal outcome of Best's lawsuit against Ringo resulted in either a substantial settlement or a loss for Ringo, though details are not fully clear. Following his dismissal from the Beatles, it's unlikely that Ringo and Best maintained direct contact, especially after Ringo relocated from Liverpool. However, reports suggest Best did extend a friendly gesture to Ringo on social media, wishing him a happy 80th birthday. Regarding Paul McCartney, there is no documented evidence of direct post-firing contact with Pete Best. Biographies suggest McCartney may have harbored jealousy over Best's popularity with female fans early on, as both men were considered equally attractive. McCartney's confidence in his own musical talent and stage presence, which were widely acknowledged, contrasted with perceptions of Best's contribution to the band, potentially influencing the dynamics within the Beatles at the time. The only known post-firing contacts between Pete Best and the Beatles were indirect or mediated through intermediaries. Best reportedly had the best rapport with John Lennon among the band members, although John publicly criticized Best's drumming abilities, describing him as limited and needing training during their Hamburg days. Despite this, John's ex-wife Cynthia held a more positive view of Best, acknowledging his differences from the rest of the band. Mona Best, Pete's mother, loaned some of her father's military medals to John for use on the Sgt. Pepper album cover, a gesture that Pete himself had no involvement in. There's no evidence suggesting a direct reconnection between Pete Best and John Lennon later on. During the release of Anthology 1 in the mid-1990s, the Beatles, comprising Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney, decided to include tracks that Best performed on, ensuring he received performer royalties, which amounted to millions. Despite this financial acknowledgement, there's no indication that any of the Beatles personally reached out to Pete Best with a monetary thank you for his contributions to the band. The decision-making process regarding inclusion in the anthology likely did not require consultation with Best, given his lack of rights to band or master recordings based on the contractual arrangements of the time. It's plausible that EMI managed any royalty disputes through releases signed by Best. Neil Aspinall, who managed Apple Corps for many years, likely maintained contact with Best due to his relationship with Rogue, Pete's half-brother fathered by Aspinall with Mona Best. This connection suggests that individual Beatles had no direct need to reach out to Pete Best personally over business matters. Was Pete Best really not a good enough drummer? According to Best, Brian Epstein told him he was not a good enough drummer, and Ringo Starr was the better drummer. The other Beatles, as well as producers, musicians, and critics who had heard Best play with the group, confirmed this reasoning. John Lennon said that Best was recruited only because they needed a drummer to go to Hamburg. We were pretty sick of Pete Best, too, because he was a lousy drummer, you know? He never improved, you know? And we were always going to dump him when we could find a decent drummer. By the time we'd rolled back from Germany, we'd trained him to keep a stick to keep going up and down at 4 in the bar. He couldn't do much else. Paul McCartney stated that Best was good, but a bit limited. McCartney remembered, George Martin was used to drummers being very in time, because all the big band session drummers he used had a great sense of time. Now, our Liverpool drummers had a sense of spirit, emotion, economy even, but not a deadly sense of time. This would bother producers making a record. George took us to one side and said, "I'm really unhappy with the drummer. Would you consider changing him?" We said, "No, we can't." It was one of those terrible things you go through as kids. Can we betray him? No. But our career was on the line. Maybe they were going to cancel our contract. McCartney later suggested Ringo's drumming was a significant improvement over Best's. The truth was, we just kind of fell in love with Ringo's drumming. Ringo was in another band, and we had Pete, and we were working, and we used to see this other band. We said, "God, that drummer's good." And one night, Pete couldn't do it, and Ringo sat in for him. And we all just went, gasp. Behind us was this powerhouse, and this person who was like taking care of the job. And we went, oh dear. George Harrison also recalled his preference for Ringo Starr's drumming, noting, Ringo kept sitting in with the band. And every time Ringo sat in with the band, it just seemed like this was it. Ringo Starr himself expressed his belief in his own abilities, stating, "I felt I was a much better drummer than Best was." Critics and historians have been equally critical of Pete Best's drumming abilities. Richie Unterberger described Best's drumming during the Decca audition as thinly textured and rather unimaginative, noting that he tended to push the beat too fast. Unterberger contrasted this with his assessment of Ringo Starr, whom he considered more talented. Mike Savage, the session engineer, echoed these sentiments, commenting, "I thought Pete Best was very average and didn't keep good time. You could pick up a better drummer in any pub in London." Ian MacDonald, a Beatles historian, pointed out Best's limitations during the EMI recording session of Love Me Do, noting his inconsistency and how it affected the group's performance. Beatles critic Alan W. Pollock compared different versions of Love Me Do, featuring Best, Starr, and Andy White, ultimately concluding that Best's drumming was incredibly unsteady and tasteless in his version. After the Beatles had signed a contract with EMI, producer Ron Richards candidly assessed Pete Best's drumming ability, stating, "Pete Best wasn't very good. It was me who said to producer George Martin he's useless. We've got to change this drummer." George Martin himself confirmed this sentiment, remarking, "Best couldn't play drums very well. I mean, he couldn't keep time too well. And I was aware that the band weren't tight. They needed that sort of binding force that a good drummer should give them. So I said to Beatles manager Brian Epstein, "I'll get another drummer for the recording session." Despite his decision to recommend a different drummer for the recording session, Martin claimed to have been surprised when he learned that Best had been dismissed from stage performances. He recounted receiving the news over the telephone from Mona Best, Pete's mother, stating, "I never suggested that Pete Best must go. All I said was that for the purposes of the Beatles' first record, I would rather use a sessions man. I never thought that Brian Epstein would let him go. He seemed to be the most saleable commodity as far as looks went. It was a surprise when I learned that they had dropped Pete. The drums were important to me for a record, but they didn't matter much otherwise. Fans don't pay particular attention to the quality of the drumming." According to biographer Bob Spitz, Pete Best's drumming style was limited to playing fours, a basic technique where kick drum notes are played on every quarter note to maintain the beat. Engineer Ron Richards recounted unsuccessful efforts to teach Best more complex rhythms for different songs, as documented in Spitz's book. Best himself disputed the official reason given for his dismissal, stating it never held up water and dismissing it as inadequate. On the David Letterman show, he attributed the decision to jealousy. In 1968, authorized Beatles biographer Hunter Davies criticized the handling of Best's firing as one of the few murky incidents in the Beatles' history, describing it as sneaky. Decades later, Mark Lewisohn reflected that despite any shortcomings Best may have had, his dismissal was unjustified given the band's success and financial stability at the time. Lewisohn characterized it as the most underhanded, unfortunate, and unforgivable chapter in the Beatles' rise to monumental power. Band chemistry. Epstein, in his autobiography, asserted that Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison found Best too conventional to fit the Beatles' image, noting a lack of rapport with George and Paul. Cynthia Lennon's book and other sources confirm that while the trio often spent time together writing and socializing in Hamburg and Liverpool, Best typically kept to himself, distancing him from the group's shared experiences and camaraderie. Astrid Kirchherr, a German photographer, made a lasting impression on the band when she asked to photograph them, unlike other groups content with snapshots by friends. During a photo session the next morning at Heiligengeistfeld near the Reeperbahn, Kirchherr excluded Best, who chose not to attend. Dot Rohn, McCartney's girlfriend at the time, later observed Best as quiet and disengaged from group conversations during her visits to Hamburg. Epstein reportedly grew frustrated with Best's reluctance to adopt the iconic mop-top hairstyle favored by the band as part of their unified image. However, Best later clarified in a BBC Radio Merseyside interview that he was never directly asked to change his hairstyle. Kirchherr elaborated that Stuart Sutcliffe, inspired by her boyfriend Klaus Vormann's hairstyle, was the first to embrace the look by discarding Brill Cream, a styling product unsuitable for Best's curly hair. McCartney reflected on Jeff Britton's brief tenure with Wings, likening it to Pete Best's time with the Beatles. He was a really good drummer, but there was something that didn't quite click with the rest of us. We had a common sense of humor and camaraderie, and he was almost part of it all, but not quite. So he left the band, and we were searching for someone who would truly fit. He elaborated to Mark Lewisohn that while George Martin suggested replacing their drummer, the Beatles were initially content with Best. We were happy with him. He performed well in the clubs. McCartney also noted, Pete was never quite like us. We were the quirky trio, and Pete was perhaps a bit more grounded. He had a different demeanor from us, not as inclined toward the arts. Harrison acknowledged Best's frequent absences and health issues. Pete kept getting sick and missing gigs. He admitted his role in pushing for Ringo's permanent inclusion. I influenced Paul and John until they agreed to the idea. Difficulties between Mona Best and others. Before Epstein took over the Beatles' management, Mona had been heavily involved in handling their early gigs and promotions. According to Joe Flannery, a promoter and manager, Mona played a crucial role in arranging significant early performances and supporting the band upon their return from Hamburg. However, her involvement came with challenges due to her assertive nature. Lennon confided to Flannery that Mona reminded him of his Aunt Mimi, bossy, and he felt she was primarily focused on advancing Pete's career. Despite this, the Beatles maintained a cordial relationship with Mona, often meeting her during visits to Neil Aspinall's London home, where they would bring small gifts acquired during their travels. Mona's support extended to allowing them to use her father's military medals for the Sgt. Pepper album cover photo shoot. Although Epstein initially expressed reluctance to dismiss Pete Best, Mona's contractual ties to the band created complications. Epstein found her interference in the Beatles' management and her strong opinions about Pete's career handling increasingly problematic. Her recent involvement in her son Rogue's birth further complicated matters, potentially posing a scandal at a critical juncture for the Beatles. Epstein, wary of Mona's influence and the potential disruption it could cause, aimed to assert full control over the band's affairs without her involvement. Popularity. Best's popularity among fans became a contentious issue within the Beatles, particularly due to his reputation as the band's most attractive member, which garnered significant attention from female fans. Spencer Lee, a presenter on Radio Merseyside, chronicled Best's dismissal and suggested that jealousy, especially from McCartney, played a role in the decision. In an issue of Mersey Beat, music publication in Liverpool, Bob Wooler praised Best's presence and described him as musically authoritative and physically magnetic, drawing comparisons to a teenage heartthrob. During a Teenager's Turn showcase in Manchester, while Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison received applause upon entering the stage, Best's appearance prompted screams from adoring fans. McCartney's father, Jim McCartney, criticized Best for attracting all the attention, calling his actions selfish and urging him to include the other band members in the limelight. In 1963, during a televised interview in Britain, Mona, accompanied by Pete, discussed his dismissal from the Beatles. Mona: "From a clash of personalities standpoint, that may have been it because Peter did have a tremendous fan club compared to the others. Perhaps too good-looking?" Mona: "I'll let others make that judgment, but from my perspective, we're not here to cast aspersions on the boys because there are no hard feelings, really. There were initially, but as they say, success is hard won and these things happen. It's just the way it was handled that has upset us. That's all. If it had been more straightforward, it would have been more acceptable." After the Beatles. After Best's dismissal, Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison expressed regret over the way it was handled. Lennon acknowledged their cowardice in delegating the task to Epstein, saying, "We made Brian do it." McCartney expressed sympathy for Best, recognizing his potential, stating, "I do feel sorry for him because of what he could have been on to." Harrison admitted their failure in communicating the decision to Best, remarking, "We weren't very good at telling Pete he had to go," and reflecting, "Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have handled it better." In contrast, Starr felt no remorse, asserting, "I never felt sorry. I was not involved." After his dismissal, Epstein offered Best a position as the drummer for the Mersey Beats, but Best declined the offer. Feeling disappointed and depressed, Best withdrew from public life for 2 weeks, avoiding questions about his abrupt departure from the Beatles. On 25 September 1962, Best's solicitor sent a letter to Epstein demanding damages for wrongful dismissal, arguing that Epstein was obligated to find work for Best since his name was on the Beatles' original management contract. Epstein responded by stating that he had already secured another group for Best, that Best lacked the necessary talent to fulfill his obligations to the Beatles, and that Best had left the band voluntarily. Epstein secretly arranged for Best to join Lee Curtis and the All-Stars through his booking agent partner, Joe Flannery. Eventually, The group split from Curtis to become Pete Best and the All-Stars, signing with Decca Records. Their single, I'm Gonna Knock on Your Door, was released, but did not achieve success. The Pete Best Combo. After relocating to the United States, Pete Best joined songwriters Wayne Bickerton and Tony Waddington to form the Pete Best Four, later expanding to the Pete Best Combo, a quintet. They embarked on tours across the United States, blending 1950s classics with original compositions and recording for small labels, but achieved limited success. Their efforts culminated in an album release on Savage Records titled Best of the Beatles, cleverly playing on Best's name, which initially disappointed buyers expecting a Beatles compilation. Following the band's dissolution, Bickerton and Waddington found greater success as prolific songwriters in the 1960s and 1970s, penning hits for groups like the Flirtations and the Rubettes. In 1996, Cherry Red Records reissued the Pete Best Combo's recordings as a CD compilation. Reviewing the album, Richie Unterberger noted the music's energetic quality and praised Bickerton and Waddington's catchy songwriting, though he critiqued Best's drumming as average. The Pete Best Combo's influence extended to other bands, with American garage rockers Liars covering their song The Way I Feel About You on their 1984 album, On Fire, later years. After deciding to exit the entertainment industry, Pete Best withdrew from discussing his association with the Beatles, as noted in Hunter Davies' authorized biography of the band in 1968. He expressed bitterness in later years, writing in his autobiography that the Beatles contributed to his downfall by spreading gossip that he was never truly a member, portrayed him as unsociable, and labeled him a poor mixer. Best felt abandoned, recalling, "There was not a single friendly word from any one of them." Tensions escalated when a 1965 Playboy interview with Lennon and Starr suggested Best's occasional absence due to illness was attributed to taking pills. Feeling defamed, Best sued the Beatles for defamation of character, settling out of court for a sum much less than the $18 million he initially sought. During Davies' biography work, he noted the Beatles' discomfort when discussing Best, sensing their unease over their handling of his dismissal. This discomfort stemmed from their acknowledgement that circumstances could have easily placed them in Best's position. Best's struggles culminated in a suicide attempt during the 1960s, thwarted by the intervention of his mother, Mona, and his brother, Rory. In 1963, Pete Best married Kathy, whom he met at an early Beatles show, and they have remained together ever since, raising 2 daughters and welcoming 4 grandchildren into their lives. Initially, Best worked in manual labor, loading bread into delivery vans for $8 a week, equivalent to $200 in 2024. His educational qualifications later enabled him to secure a position as a civil servant at the Garston Job Centre in Liverpool, where he eventually rose to become the training manager for the northwest of England. Reflecting on his role, Best recalled dealing with individuals seeking employment, often facing emotional challenges as they transitioned to new fields. Over time, Best began granting media interviews, sharing insights about his tenure with the Beatles, and serving as a technical advisor for the television film Birth of the Beatles. Despite his complex history with the band, he maintained a fondness for their music, acknowledging himself as a fan and owning their records. In 1995, when the surviving Beatles released Anthology 1, featuring 10 tracks with Best on drums from their early auditions, Best unexpectedly received a substantial windfall, estimated between $1 million and $4 million from the sales. This windfall came as a surprise, facilitated by a phone call, according to Philip Norman, from Paul McCartney himself, though Best asserts it was Neil Aspinall who contacted him. McCartney reportedly acknowledged past grievances and offered Best a financial settlement, which Best accepted. Notably, the album cover of Anthology 1 features a collage of torn photographs, including an early group photo that originally included Best, albeit with his head replaced by Ringo Starr's head from another photograph. A smaller photo of Best appears on the left side of the cover. Additionally, Best appeared in a Carlsberg Lager advertisement aired during the debut episode of the anthology TV series on ITV in November 1995, humorously linking his name to the beer brand with the tagline, "Probably the Pete Best lager in the world," a playful twist on Carlsberg's famous slogan, "The Pete Best Band." In 1988, after steadfastly declining invitations for 2 decades, Pete Best finally yielded and performed at a Beatles convention in Liverpool. Joined by his brother Roag, they showcased their musical talents, marking a pivotal moment when Best's wife and mother encouraged him to consider a return to show business. Following this event, Best embraced a renewed career in music. Today, he tours internationally with the Pete Best Band, where he shares drumming duties with his younger brother, Roag. Their album, Hayman's Green, featuring entirely original material, debuted on various dates: 16th September 2008 in the U.S., 24th October 2008 globally, excluding the U.K., and 27th October 2008 in the U.K. In retrospect, Pete Best's journey through and beyond his tenure with the Beatles remains a complex tale of missed opportunities, personal resilience, and eventual musical resurgence. What are your thoughts on Pete Best's role in the Beatles' early history, and how do you perceive his contributions to their legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content exploring the fascinating stories behind music's most iconic figures.